welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're going to be continuing our reading from Doll Bones by Holly Black. Last time, Zach's dad had just thrown out his characters, his action figures, that he uses to play the role-playing game with his friends. He is now not sure if he'll ever be able to play again, but he's keeping what happened a secret from Poppy and Alice. Also, the Queen, played by the creepy porcelain doll from Poppy's mother's display case, has entered the game, but we don't know exactly what her story is yet. Alright, Chapter 3. The next morning, Zach pushed his limp cereal around in a bowl of milk as his mom poured herself a second cup of coffee. Light filtered in through the dirty window pane to make the scarred wood on the kitchen table show the pale watermarks from wet mugs and the greenish smudge where Zach had once drawn a spaceship in permanent marker. He traced the faint outline of it with a finger. "Your father called the trash company last night," his mother said. Zach blinked and looked up at her. She took another sip of coffee. "He called the dump, too. Asked them if there was any way to get your toys back. He even offered to drive over there and look for them himself. But there was no way. I'm sorry. I know that he did a stupid thing, but he honestly tried to fix it, sweetheart." Zach felt weirdly numb, as though everything that happened was on a slight delay. He knew what she was saying was supposed to be important, but somehow he couldn't make it matter. He felt tired, too, as though he hadn't slept at all, even though he'd actually slept so deeply that the ringing of his alarm had seemed to bring him up from the bottom of something deep and dark. He'd had to fight through his dreams to wake. "Okay," he said, because there was nothing else to say. "Tonight we're going to sit down and have a family discussion. Your dad was brought up by a very strict man, and as much as he hates it, he acts like his father sometimes. It's what he knows, honey." Zach shrugged and put a scoop of soggy cereal in his mouth to keep from telling her that he'd rather be hung upside down by his toes over a blazing fire than talk to his father. Still chewing, he grabbed his backpack and started for school. "We can discuss more later," his mother said with false cheer, moments before he slammed his way out the door. The cold air felt like a slap in the face. He was relieved not to see Poppy and Alice on the sidewalk. They all lived close enough that sometimes they ran into each other on the way to school, and they usually walked home together. But this morning he hurried along the side of the street, glad to be alone. He kept his head down as he stalked along, kicking rocks and chunks of loose asphalt into the road. When he saw the school building in the distance, he wondered what would happen if he just kept going, the same way his father had left them 3 years ago. If he just kept walking until he came to a new place where no one knew him, lied about his age, and got a job delivering newspapers or something. Well, he didn't quite know what he would do after that. By the time he made up his mind to go to school, he was late. Mr. Lockwood glowered at him as he slunk into class just after the bell. He sat at his desk and drew nothing in the margins of his notebook. If a story idea came to him, he concentrated on something else until it went away. At lunch, his sandwich tasted like cardboard. He threw out his apple. After school, he told the coach he was too sick to go to practice, but really, it was just that he didn't want to. He didn't want to do much of anything. He started walking home, thinking he could sit in front of the television until Mom got home from work, then tell her the same thing he told the coach. A few minutes later, Alice caught up with him, the slap of her shoes on the pavement heralding her approach. He felt like an idiot for taking the same old route and not expecting to see any of his friends. "Zach?" Alice asked, out of breath from running. She was wearing a blue t-shirt with a creature on it that appeared to be half brontosaurus, half kitten. Her braids were pulled back into a headband, and little feather earrings hung from her ears. He had no idea what to say to her. He wanted to ask her about the day before when she was giggling with her friends. He wanted to know why she hadn't talked to him. But that seemed forever ago, and so much had happened since. He almost didn't feel like the same person. A kid named Leo waved to them, walking in their direction. He had big glasses and was always saying crazy things. He was like a random generator of weirdness. "Hey," he said, "Poppy wanted me to tell you to walk slow. She's getting a book from the librarian." "Oh," Zach said, feeling doomed. He knew what would happen next. One by one, the mass of kids who walked home together would gather and then peel away into clumps headed in different directions, until it was just Poppy and Alice and him. Then one of them would ask, "Want to play?" Like always, and he would have to say something. "You okay?" Alice asked. "Yeah," said Leo. "You don't look so good, Zach. Somebody walk over your grave?" He blinked a couple of times. At least Leo was acting like his normal crazy self. That was one thing that wasn't going to change. "What?" "That's what my grandpa always said. You never heard that?" "No," Zach said. His foot sent a few leaves spiraling up into the air. Talking about graves made him think about walking home the night before, when he thought he heard the wind howling at his heels. He shivered. "So my grave is going to be in front of Thomas Peebles Middle School? That's so lame." "It doesn't mean you're going to be buried here," Alice rolled her eyes. "It's a saying. It means somewhere, someone is stepping on the place where you're going to be buried." "So it could be any old place?" Zach asked, shaking his head. "How does that help to know?" "It's not supposed to help," Leo said. "It's just supposed to be true." "What are you guys talking about?" Poppy asked, bounding up to them. She had on a black sweater and was bouncing on her blue chucks, one of the pink laces untied and dragging muddily behind her. Her hair was in coppery pigtails, and her eyeliner looked smudged on one eye, like maybe she'd forgotten it was there and rubbed over it. "Nothing," Zach said with a shrug. Poppy looked over at Alice and raised her eyebrows. "Nothing like nothing, or nothing like something?" Alice shook her head and smiled, but then turned her smile down at the pavement, like she was embarrassed. Zach had no idea what was going on. He wondered if it had to do with yesterday and the giggling, but couldn't think of how to ask. Sometimes it seemed to him that girls spoke a different language, but he couldn't figure out when they learned it. He was pretty sure that they all used to speak the same language a year ago. "We're talking about superstitions," said Leo, "like how stepping where someone's grave is going to be makes them shudder involuntarily." He always talked with big words, like a textbook. Superstitions, shudder, involuntarily. Some kids said it was because his mother was a part-time teacher over at the college. But Zach thought that was just how Leo was. "Like stepping on a crack is supposed to break your mother's back?" Poppy asked. "I tried that once when I was really little. I was so mad at Mom, but I don't even remember why now. Wait, no, I do remember. Nate pushed me in the backyard and I whipped a branch at him. The branch got him good, right above the eye. He was bleeding like crazy, so even though he started it, I was the one who got in trouble. I stomped on cracks all up and down the block, and the next day, she slipped in the garden and sprained her ankle." "No way," Leo said. Zach could see him mentally filing that away with all his other oddball stories. Poppy laughed. "It's not like she actually broke her back. I mean, it was just a coincidence that she fell. But it scared me at the time. I thought I was some kind of powerful enchanter or something." "And you avoided cracks for years after," Alice said. "Remember that? You would be crazy careful, always putting your feet sideways and going up on your tiptoes and stuff. You swerved around like a Roomba robot ballerina." "Roombarina," Zach said automatically. For some reason, words were funnier smashed together. "Roombarina," Alice echoed, spinning on one toe, then stumbling a little. "Exactly." "That's a good portmanteau," said Leo. Zach nodded, the way he usually did when he had no idea what Leo was talking about. They passed the old Episcopalian church with the big spire as they headed down Main Street. They walked past the barber shop, the pizza place where Zach had birthday parties when he was little, the bus station next to the post office, and the big old graveyard on the hill. Zach had followed this exact route many times, his fingers curled in his mother's when he was little, and then gripping the handlebars of his bike when he was older, and now on foot to and from school. This was the town he'd grown up in, and even though it was small, and a lot of the stores on Main Street were closed, even though windows were boarded up and rentals went unrented, Zach was used to the place. He couldn't imagine living anywhere else, which was a real stumbling block in imagining running away. "That stuff is real," Leo said. "For a while, my parents moved us around a lot, and there was this one apartment we lived in that was haunted. I swear, when the ghost was in the room, the air would get really cold, even in the middle of summer, and there was one spot that was always ice cold. You could put a space heater on top of it, and it wouldn't warm up. That's where somebody died. The landlady even said so." "Did you ever actually see the ghost?" Alice asked. Leo shook his head. "No, but sometimes he would move things, like my mom's keys. Mom would yell for the ghost to give them back, and then, 9 times out of 10, she'd find them right after. Mom says you have to know how to talk to ghosts, or they'll walk all over you." Poppy smiled like she did when she was anticipating revealing something exciting. A twist to a story, a shocking turn, a villain's big move. Her cheeks were pink from the wind, and her eyes were bright. "Have you ever heard this one? When you drive past a cemetery, you have to hold your breath. If you don't, the spirits of the newly dead can get in your body through your mouth, and they can possess you." Zack shivered, the hairs along his neck rising. Without meaning to, he imagined the taste of a ghost, like an acrid mouthful of smoke. He spat in the dirt, trying to untaste the idea. "Ugh," Alice said, into the silence that followed the end of Poppy's story. "You made me hold my breath. I was totally just trying not to inhale. Anyway, we already passed the graveyard. Shouldn't you have told us the story before we passed it? Unless you wanted us to get possessed." Zack thought again about the night before, and the feeling of something right behind him, breathing on his neck, something that was about to reach out and grasp for him with its cold fingers. The story was like that, grabbing hold of him and promising that he'd think of it every time he was near a graveyard. Poppy kept smiling. She made her eyes really wide and spoke in a flat, effectless tone. "Maybe I'm not Poppy anymore. Maybe I didn't know not to hold my breath and I learned the hard way. Maybe a spirit possessed me, and now it's warning you because it's too late. The spirits are already inside you." "Come on, stop," Alice said, shoving Poppy's shoulder. They both began to laugh. Leo laughed nervously along with them. "That's why it's a scary story, because you can't do the one thing that would protect you. You'll never know if you hold your breath long enough or let it out too soon, and you can't hold your breath forever." "The smiling was creepy," said Zack. "Anyone tell you you have a creepy smile, Poppy?" She looked very pleased with herself. They walked a few blocks more and then came to the place where Leo split off for home. He waved goodbye and headed off, cutting across a big lawn toward a trailer park. Then it was just Alice and Poppy and Zack walking the few blocks to the development where their houses were clustered, all 3 nearly identical from the outside. His heart started to speed up again, and his legs turned to lead, because there was no way to avoid the conversation that was coming, even though he wanted to with all his might. Chapter 4. The air was cool, the trees bright with yellow and red leaves, and lawns thick with a wilted carpet of brown. A gust of air shook the branches above Zachary and blew his bangs over his eyes. He pushed them back impatiently and looked up at the cloudless sky. He thought of all of them, all his characters, stuck in the duffel bag, rats chewing at the edges. He thought of bugs crawling over them and trash dumped on top of them. He thought of the folded-up questions still in his backpack, and of how he'd said William's nightmare was being buried alive. "Hey," said Alice, "do you guys want to meet up? I have an idea for what might—" "I can't," Zack said quickly. He'd planned out a whole speech the night before, lying on his back staring up at the ceiling of his room. But he couldn't remember any of it now. He took a deep breath and blurted out the only thing he could think to say. "I don't want to play anymore." Poppy frowned in confusion. "What are you talking about?" For a moment, it seemed possible to take the words back, to tell Poppy and Alice what had really happened. He could explain what his dad had done, and how angry he was, and how he had no idea what to do now except to be angry. He could tell them how he didn't want all the stories to remain unfinished. He could tell them how he felt like pieces of himself were gone, like part of him had been thrown out with his action figures. "I've been really busy with school and basketball and everything," he said instead, his voice low. "I mean, you guys can keep playing or whatever." "You mean ever? Like you don't want to play ever again?" When Poppy got upset, her neck would flush a blotchy red. He could see it coloring, as pink as her wind-whipped cheeks. She launched into a slightly desperate negotiation. "It's just that we're in the middle of something big. We came all the way through the gray country and to the blackest sea. Couldn't we just finish this part?" He'd been looking forward to crossing swords with the leader of the mermaids, who knew the way to an ancient underwater city full of secrets, including the secret to completing the Queen's quest and lifting her curse. Plus, there was the promise of fighting sharks. There were even hints that they might find a clue to William the Blade's parentage, plus the treasure of the Shark Prince, piles of gold and jewels so vast that Lady J had been questing after it since she had first heard the story as an orphan beggar child. Remembering how awesome it was going to be made every new thought about playing hurt like the back of a shoe rubbing against a burst blister. "We're too old anyway, don't you think?" he made himself say. Alice looked stricken. "That's stupid," Poppy said. "We weren't too old the day before yesterday." "We were," Zack said. "It's because of your friends on the team, isn't it?" Alice glanced over at Poppy, like maybe they'd had this conversation before. "You think they're going to find out and hassle you." "I don't think anything," Zack sighed. "I just don't want to play anymore." "You don't mean that," Poppy said. He forced the words out. "I do." "Maybe we could just take a break," Alice said slowly. "Do something else for a while." "Sure," he said with a shrug. "And then maybe if you change your mind..." Zack thought about the time that Alice had first brought her Lady J doll to a game, 3 months back. Before Lady J, Alice's favorite character had been a Barbie named Aurora, who had been raised by a herd of carnivorous horses. But one Monday morning on the walk to school, Alice explained that she'd repainted an action figure from a thrift store over the weekend. She wanted to play somebody new. Lady J was different, all right. She was a thief who'd grown up on the streets of the biggest city in all their kingdoms, called Haven. And she didn't care about anything except for what she could steal and what fun she could have along the way. Lady J was crazy. She got a ride on William's ship because she wanted a ride to the Shark Prince's treasure. But every time he docked, Lady J kept stealing from people, so they'd been banned from landing in at least 5 different places. William had to bail her out of situation after situation, until he finally got her to agree to stay aboard the Neptune's Pearl. Except then she wound up doing things like climbing the mast with a blindfold on, just to show off. Alice's descriptions of Lady J's antics had made Zack laugh so hard that his stomach hurt. His stomach hurt now, too, but for a different reason. "I'm not going to change my mind," Zack said numbly. "But it doesn't make any sense," Poppy said, not willing to let him off that easily. "You can't just stop. We're in the middle of a scene. What happens to everyone else? What happens to Lady J? Even if she gets away from the mermaids, what then? What about the crew?" William had promised Lady J that he'd take her to the place marked on the map as the lair of the Shark Prince. He'd sworn it on his honor and on the Neptune's Pearl. "Maybe one of your people can take over as captain." Zack hated the idea, but the Neptune's Pearl wasn't a particular toy that one of them owned. It was just a cut-out piece of paper, and there was no reason for him to hang on to it. "Maybe they'll make her walk the plank," said Poppy. "I don't care what happens," Zack said, and all the simmering anger at his father at this conversation and at everything bled into his voice then, turning it cruel. "You figure it out. I don't care anymore." "Okay," Alice said, holding up her hands like she was surrendering. "How about we walk over to the dirt mall, or bike over, whatever, see what's at the used bookstore, and play the arcade games in the movie theater lobby. Like I said, a break." Alice wasn't allowed there, so it was a generous offer. "I don't really feel like it today," Zack said, "but thanks." They were almost to his street, almost home. He picked up his pace. "Did you finish the questions?" Poppy asked him. He hitched his backpack higher on his shoulder and shook his head. The note was folded and tucked away in the front zippered pocket, scribbled on and illustrated, full proof that he did care. He couldn't give it to her. She held out her hand. "I didn't answer them," he said. "What do you want?" "Give me the paper back anyway. Maybe I'll make up my own answers." He frowned. "I don't have them anymore. I lost them." "You lost them?" Poppy yelled. He wondered if she was afraid of someone finding out what she'd asked. He would have been. "They're probably just in your bag, right?" Alice said. "You could look." "Sorry," Zack mumbled. "Like I said, I don't know where they are." "What happened?" Poppy asked, grabbing his arm. "What's so different all of a sudden? Why are you so different?" He turned to look at her. He had to get away before he said something that he couldn't take back. I don't know. I don't want to play, that's all. Fine, Poppy said. Just bring your people over one last time, one final time, so that they can say goodbye to our people. I can't, he said. I just can't, Poppy. I just want to say goodbye. The hurt on Poppy's face was raw, and so much like his own that it was hard to look at her. They would want that. They'll miss Rose and Lady J and Aaron and Lysander, even if you don't. They're not real, you know. He knew he was being a jerk, but it felt good to lash out, even if it was at the wrong person. They're not real and they can't want anything. Stop being such a loser. You can't play pretend forever. Alice sucked in her breath. The red blotches on Poppy's neck had moved to her cheeks. She looked like she was about to cry or hit him. Zack wasn't sure which. When she spoke, though, her voice was flat and grim. The Queen. What if I take her out of the cabinet? I know where my mom keeps the key. I'll play her. She knows all the secrets, and she'll give you whatever you want. Everything. If you come tomorrow, you can have everything you want. Zack hesitated. The great Queen who ruled over the Silver Hills, the Grey Country, the land of the witches, and the whole Blackest Sea. She would have information about William the Blade's father. With her blessing, all his crimes might be forgiven, his curse lifted, and William would be allowed to dock the Neptune's pearl anywhere he wanted. It was a big thing for Poppy to promise, especially because her mother would be furious if Poppy actually took the doll out from the cabinet. The doll was very, very old and, according to Poppy's mother, worth a lot of money. She'd be worth a lot less if they touched her papery cotton dress or pawed at her brittle straw gold curls. And if the Queen was free from her cage, then who knew what that meant for the world? For a moment, he'd forgotten that there was no more game. It was an unpleasant shock to remember. No matter how tempting it was, Zack couldn't play. There was no William the Blade any more. Sorry, he said, turning toward his house with a shrug. Poppy made a strangled sound. Alice said something under her breath. Zack bent his head, closed his eyes, and kept walking. That night, at the kitchen table, Zack poked at his baked chicken. He wasn't hungry. Your mother's pointed out to me that if I want you to start acting like a grown-up, I can't keep treating you like a kid, his father was saying, sounding overly sincere. She's right. I shouldn't have tossed out your stuff because it's my job to guide you toward the right choices, not to make all those choices for you. The tone in his father's voice made Zack think of last year, when he'd gotten into a fight at school. His mother had made him sit in the principal's office until he was ready to tell Harry Perillo that he was sorry for punching him, even though Zack hadn't been sorry at all. Zack's father's apology sounded as forced as his had. I know that it's hard to adjust to us being back together, Mom said, but we're going to keep working on it. Zachary, do you have anything you want to say? Nope, Zack said. That's okay, said his dad, getting up from the table and clapping Zack on the shoulder. We understand each other, don't we? Awkward silence stretched between them. Finally, Zack nodded, because he did understand his father. He understood his wanting to make Mom happy. He understood not being sorry. It just didn't make Zack forgive him. The next day, Zack went to practice and tried to blot out thoughts of Poppy and Alice and his father by playing ball so aggressively that he got lectured by his coach and benched for the rest of the practice. He tried not to think about the story, which would go on without him, flowing around the empty spaces where his characters used to be until they were swallowed up and forgotten. He thought again about running away, but the more time passed, the more he'd realized that he had nowhere to go. Since his father was at the restaurant that night, his mother let him eat ravioli from a can on the couch in front of the television. They didn't talk much, although he caught her shooting him worried looks. In the morning, Zack asked her to drive him to school, and that afternoon he went home with Alex Rios. They played video games in Alex's finished basement on a bigger television than Zack had seen outside of a store. The day after that, Alice walked up to Zack while he was shooting baskets at recess and pressed a note into his hand. A couple of the other guys yelled, "Go ask Alice," and "Somebody's got a girlfriend," as she walked off, which made her hunch her shoulders like she was braced against a hard wind. "Shut up," Zack said, shoving Peter Lewis, since he was standing closest. "What?" Peter said. "I didn't say anything." The note was folded up in a square this time, with his name carefully printed in blue ink. When he opened it, there were only 3 short sentences on the lined paper. Something happened with the Queen. Go to the hermit's place by the Silver Hills after school. It's important. Important was underlined 3 times. It's nothing, Zack told himself. He thought of the Queen's fluttering lashes and the feeling of her closed eyes following him as he walked through the room. The Queen wasn't real, though, so nothing important could have happened with her. This was just Poppy and Alice attempting to get him to show up so that they could have the same fight all over again. They wanted him to play, and he couldn't. There was nothing he could do except explain why it was over, and he couldn't bring himself to do that. What did the note say? Alex asked. She tell you she wants your skinny body? Zack tore it in half, and then in half again. Nah, she just wants my math homework. There was no practice after school that day, but he stayed late anyway, pretending there was. He managed to talk the coach into letting him shoot hoops in the gym, which he did methodically, alone, letting himself drown in the thump of the ball, the squeak of his sneakers, and the familiar smell of fresh floor wax and old sweat. Chapter 5. Zack woke in the darkness of his bedroom. He wasn't sure why, but his heart raced, adrenaline pumping through his body, as though something had activated his body's fight or flight response. He blinked in the dark, letting his eyes adjust. The moon was high enough to give the room an eerie, silvery glow. He could make out the familiar shapes of his furniture. His black cat was uncurling and stretching her long, sleek body, claws digging into the coverlet. She padded up to him, her yellow eyes full of reflected light. "What's up?" he whispered to the party, reaching out to pet her soft, triangular head and press his thumb against her ear, folding it down and rubbing it. She butted against him and started to purr. Tap. He jumped. The cat hissed, her white teeth flashing in the moonlight, and she jumped off the bed. Something small and hard had struck the window. This was no echo of a dream, no made-up story. Something really had hit the glass, smacking against one of the panes he couldn't see. One of the lower ones, hidden behind blue half-curtains. A sudden gust of wind made the branches outside shake and jitter. He couldn't help imagining the long, bony fingers of the trees scraping against the glass. When he was a little kid, he'd had a firm belief in universally observed monster rules. He'd been sure, for example, that if he kept all parts of himself on the mattress and shrouded beneath blankets, if he kept his eyes closed, and if he pretended to be asleep, then he'd be safe. He didn't know where he'd gotten the idea from. He did remember his mother saying he'd smother himself if he kept sleeping with his head under the comforter. Then, one night, quite randomly, he fell asleep with his head above the covers like a normal person, and no monster got him. Over time, he got spottier about observing his safety precautions, until he routinely slept with an arm dangling off the side of his bed and his feet kicked free of the sheets. But right then, at the sound of the wind, for one panicky moment, all he wanted was to burrow under the blankets and never come out. Tap, tap. The thing hitting the window was just a branch, he told himself, or an insomniac squirrel rattling around in the gutters, or a neighbor cat trying to pick a fight with the party. Tap. He was never going to be able to go back to sleep if he didn't look. Zack slipped out of bed, his bare feet padding over the carpet. Steeling himself and taking a deep breath, he pushed aside the curtain. There were a few scattered pebbles on the roof tiles in front of his window. That was the first thing he noticed. The second was that when he looked past the roof, he saw 2 dark figures looking up at him from a moonlit lawn. He was too surprised to shout. They had wind-blown hair and upturned faces, and for a moment he didn't know them. But then he realized it was only Poppy and Alice, not zombie girls or witches or ghosts. Alice lifted her hand in a shy wave. Poppy had another handful of pebbles and looked ready to throw them at him. He let out his breath and waved back a little unsteadily. His hammering heart started to slow. Poppy beckoned to him. "Come down," she was signaling. He thought of the note that Alice had passed him and the way she'd underlined "important," but he couldn't think of anything so important that it would lead them to sneak out of their houses on a Friday night. Alice's grandmother would ground her for the rest of forever if she found out. Zack backed away from the window. Quietly, he went to the closet and pushed his feet into a pair of sneakers. He pulled a sweater over his t-shirt and crept downstairs in his alligator pajama bottoms. The party followed, mewling plaintively, probably hoping to be fed. The under-cabinet lights in the kitchen were bright enough to stumble through by, and they managed to find his coat on a hook in the entranceway. The microwave showed the time in blinking green numbers, 3 minutes past midnight. Zack shouldered his coat on and went outside, closing the door before the cat could slip through. Poppy and Alice were waiting for him. "Hey," he whispered into the dark. "What's going on? What happened?" "Shh," Poppy said. "You'll wake up everyone. Come on." "Where to?" he asked, looking back at his house. There was a light on in his parents' bedroom upstairs. Sometimes his mother stayed up late to read. Sometimes she fell asleep with the light on. If she was still awake, the sound of them talking might carry up to her. But he wanted to know something before he just followed Alice and Poppy into the night. "The Silver Hills," Alice said. That was a junkyard that specialized in metal about half a mile from their houses. The owner bought everything from car parts to tin cans, and although no one was sure what he did with them other than let them rust in huge mounds on his property, they were a pretty impressive sight. The stripped rods, machine parts, and batteries gleamed like mountains of silver. So that's why they'd started calling it the Silver Hills. They'd come up with a whole storyline, including dwarves and trolls and a princess doll that Poppy had painted silver. Zack jogged behind Poppy and Alice, the wind cutting through his thin pajamas, making him feel both cold and sort of ridiculous. After a few minutes, Poppy pulled a flashlight out of her jacket and clicked it on. It illuminated only a narrow patch of grass and dirt, so she had to swing it back and forth to see. There was the same old high chain-link fence around the property that Zack remembered, and there was the same old abandoned shed that they'd found a few summers ago and used as a clubhouse until Alice's grandmother had found out about it and given them a speech about tetanus and how it led to something she called lockjaw. Zack wasn't sure lockjaw was a real thing, but he thought about it every time his neck felt stiff. They hadn't been there since, or at least he hadn't. He wondered if Poppy and Alice snuck out to the shed without him. They seemed full of secrets tonight. The only secret he had was one he wished he didn't. Alice opened the creaky old door and went inside. He followed nervously. Poppy sat down on the splintery floor, cross-legged, setting the flashlight against her sneakers so it lit her face. Then she unhooked her backpack from one shoulder, pulling it around onto her lap. "So, are you going to tell me what's going on?" Zack asked, sitting down across from Poppy. The wood planks were cold under his pajama pants, and he shifted, trying to get comfortable. She unzipped her bag. "You're going to laugh," she said, "but you shouldn't." He glanced over at Alice. She was leaning against one wall of the shed. "Poppy saw a ghost," she said. He tried to suppress a shudder. Ghosts weren't something you talked about in an abandoned shed at night. "You're just trying to freak me out. This is some kind of stupid—" Poppy carefully took the bone china doll from her backpack. Zack drew in his breath and went silent. The Queen's dull black eyes were open, her gaze boring into his own. He'd always thought she was creepy-looking, but in the reflected beam of the flashlight, she seemed demonic. Poppy touched the doll's face. It was pure white, like a dinner plate. Hair, dry as brush bristles, was threaded into her scalp, and her cheeks and lips were rouged a faint pink. When she was tilted onto her back, her eyes stayed open instead of closing the way they should have, as though she was still watching Zack. There was a tear at the shoulder of her thin, brittle gown, and tiny pinholes through the discolored fabric. It hadn't aged as well as the rest of the doll, and the ride in Poppy's backpack probably hadn't helped. "The Queen," Zack said unsteadily, forcing a sneer into his voice to cover his rising fear. "So what? You brought me all the way out here to see a doll?" "Just listen," Alice said. "Try not to be the huge jerk you've turned into." Alice never said stuff like that, especially not to him. It stung. "I know you told us you weren't going to come over the other day, but I thought you might anyway," Poppy said, talking fast. "And I couldn't just go to the cabinet and get the Queen if Mom was there. So I took the doll out of the case that night when we had the argument, and moved around some of Mom's other stuff to hide what I'd done. But that night, well, I saw the dead girl." "You mean you had a nightmare?" Zack said. "Just shut up a minute," said Alice. "It wasn't like a regular dream," Poppy said, her fingers smoothing back the Queen's curls, and her voice changing, going soft and chill as the night air. It reminded Zach of the way Poppy talked when she played villains, or even the Queen herself. It wasn't like dreaming at all. She was sitting on the end of my bed. Her hair was blonde, like the doll's, but it was tangled and dirty. She was wearing a nightdress smeared with mud. She told me I had to bury her. She said she couldn't rest until her bones were in her own grave, and if I didn't help her, she would make me sorry. Poppy paused, as though she was expecting him to say something sarcastic. Alice shifted uncomfortably. Zach was silent for a long moment, arrested by the images Poppy had conjured. He could almost see the girl in her stained nightgown. Her bones? He finally echoed. Did you know that bone china has real bones in it? Poppy said, tapping a porcelain cheek. Her clay was made from human bones, little girl bones. That hair threaded through the scalp is the little girl's hair, and the body of the doll is filled with her leftover ashes. A shiver ran up his spine. He closed his eyes to keep from looking at the doll in Poppy's lap. Okay, this is your idea of a funny prank. I get it. You're mad at me for not playing the game anymore, so you made up this story to scare me. What's the punchline? Did one of you rig a sheet outside to flutter from a tree or something? I told you, Alice said to Poppy under her breath. You really did rig a sheet? Zach frowned, looking out at the trees and the mounds of cans and metal. No, idiot, said Alice. I told her you wouldn't believe us, and that you wouldn't want to help. He threw up his hands in confusion. Help with what? Help you bury a doll? Why would you need to wake me up in the middle of the night to help you do that? Poppy pulled the doll to her chest, and one of the eyes closed and opened as though it was winking at him. Eleanor Kirchner is real. That's the doll girl's name. She told me about herself. Her father was some kind of worker for a china manufacturer, designing and decorating pottery, and when Eleanor died, her dad went totally crazy. He couldn't bear to put her in the ground, so he took her body back to the kilns at his job, chopped her up, and cremated her. He ground up her burnt bones and used them to make a batch of bone china, then poured it into a mold cast from one of Eleanor's favorite dolls, so her grave stayed empty. Zach tried to swallow, although his throat suddenly felt very dry. It was too easy to imagine the doll moving on her own, fluttering her painted eyelids and turning toward him, maybe opening her tiny rosebud of a mouth to scream. She told you that? Each night she told me a little bit more of her story. Illuminated by the flashlight, Poppy's face had become strange. She's not going to rest until we bury her, and she's not going to let us rest either. She promised to make us miserable unless we help her. He looked at Alice. And you believe it? You believe all this? I never believed in ghosts. No, so not at first, Alice said. No offense, Poppy, but it's a crazy story. And I'm still not totally sure, but show him the thing. It's pretty convincing. Show me what? Poppy pulled the doll's head sharply up from the body. Zach gasped at the sudden violence of it, but all that it revealed was a string and a rusty metal hook apparatus. With a twist, the queen's head came entirely off, leaving the hook still attached to the neck, hanging from the cord. Poppy slipped her fingers into the body of the doll, feeling around like she was trying to reach something. What are you doing? He stared at the disemboweled head resting on Poppy's knee. The eyes were closed now. Poppy drew out an old burlap bag from the neck cavity. Here, take this and look inside. He took the rough cloth as she turned the beam of the flashlight on it, revealing letters and a date in blocky print. The bag was full, but Zach couldn't tell what it was full with. Liverpool? He read out loud. He had a vague memory of the place from some late-night British rock documentary his mom had been watching. That's where the Beatles are from, in England. There's no way we can go there. I guess we're going to have to find out if ghost girls really can curse people, because... That's what I thought at first, Alice said, and pointed to the markings. But look again. It says East Liverpool, in Ohio. So we could get on a bus and be there by morning. She paused. And we are. We're going. Tonight. Well, technically it's morning, so we're going in the morning. He looked from the doll to Alice, and then to Poppy. This is why you brought me out here? We tried to explain yesterday, Alice said. I told you it was important. Poppy reached down and turned the flashlight beam on her watch, then shone it at him. There's a bus stopping in town at 2:15 in the morning. It's coming from Philadelphia and going to Youngstown. One of the stops is east of Liverpool. Alice said she'd come if you would too." Zach thought about the ghost story that Poppy had told about on their last walk home, the one about holding your breath when you passed a cemetery. Was she trying to play a different kind of game? A game that she was making out of their real lives? But Poppy didn't look gleeful the way she did when she had a thrilling idea. She looked pale and nervous, like she hadn't been sleeping well. "You'll really go?" he asked finally, looking at Alice. Her grandmother wouldn't like a single thing about this. Not the ghost, not the bus, definitely not Alice being out at 2 in the morning with a boy, even if the boy was just him. Alice shrugged. Zach's parents wouldn't like him going either, but that was a point in favor of the plan as far as he was concerned. And if he decided that he never wanted to come back, well, at least he'd have some company while he figured out where he was going. In stories, orphan boys became assistant pig keepers and magicians' apprentices. In real life, he wasn't sure there were any equivalent jobs. "You still haven't looked in the bag," Alice said, pointing to the burlap sack he was holding. "It's pretty weird." With trepidation, he pulled the drawstrings so that he could peer inside. Poppy handed Alice the flashlight. She held it up high, pointing it down at him. For a moment, Zach didn't know what he was seeing. The bag seemed to be full of something that looked a little bit like dark sand, with chunks of shells in it. Then he realized that the bag was full of gray ash, and what he thought were shells were actually sharp, pale pieces of bone. Of course, the leftover ashes, the remains of a ghost, of a girl, of the queen. A nameless primal terror washed over him. He wanted to drop the bag, wanted to race out of the shed and go back to bed, where he could shiver under his own covers. But he didn't move. His hands started to shake, and he drew the strings tight so he didn't have to look anymore. "Poppy thinks we can catch a bus back in the afternoon and be home by dinner time. It's only a 3-hour ride, but there aren't a lot of buses from here to there. Just this one early in the morning and another in the afternoon that gets in too late for us to ride back in time. We left a note for her parents." Despite her words, Alice's voice grew a little uncertain. Zach wondered if she'd balked at first, before she'd apparently promised Poppy that if he went, she would go too. "If these bones are real," he began, "shouldn't we tell someone? A girl died. Maybe Eleanor's father murdered her. Maybe it's some kind of cold case file." "No one's going to care about some old story," Poppy said. "And even if they did, they'd just take the doll away from us, put her in a museum or display her somewhere, and then her spirit would be angry." He paused, considering everything she'd said, and also what she hadn't said. "Did you find the ashes before or after you dreamed about Eleanor Kirchner?" "I'm going whether you both come or not," Poppy said, snatching the burlap bag out of his hand. He guessed that meant she'd found the ashes first. "Whether you believe me or not, I'm going to bury her like she wants." Getting on a bus in the middle of the night to a place they'd never been was daunting. It also seemed a little bit like an adventure. "Okay," he said. "Fine, I'll come." Alice looked at him in wide-eyed surprise. He wondered for the first time if she'd been planning on him saying no, and hadn't considered the possibility that he'd say yes. If so, she probably should have told him. "I'll come," he continued, "so long as you both promise not to ask me about the game, or why I don't want to play, okay? No more hassling me about it." "Okay," said Poppy. "Okay," said Alice. "Okay," said Zach. "You need to get ready fast," Poppy said, "and leave a note so your parents don't freak out. Just tell them you got up early and that you'll be back tonight." "And you're sure the bus will get us back in time?" Alice asked. "You're positive?" "Yes," Poppy said. "I planned it all out. Just bring food and supplies, okay, Zach? We'll meet at the mailbox in 20 minutes. She switched off the flashlight, and for a moment the shed was plunged into darkness. Zach blinked, willing his eyes to adjust. By the time they did, Poppy had put away the queen, so at least her terrible head with its winking eye was hidden. Zach walked home through the hushed streets, his sneakers wet with dew from the frosted grass. There was a kind of quiet that hung over the world in the middle of the night, as though there was no one else awake anywhere. It felt ripe with magic and endless possibility. He snuck back into his house and stood for a long moment in the dark kitchen, a feeling of great daring swelling his heart. When he finally went to the cabinets, he felt as though he was provisioning himself for one of those epic fantasy quests, the kind that required a lot of jerky or something called hardtack that he'd read about soldiers eating during the Civil War, and which he thought might be a kind of bread. His mother didn't have either of those things, nor did she have elven lembas, which had kept Frodo and Sam from starving on the way to Mount Doom, and always made him think of matzah, which his mom also didn't have. He did find a can of orange soda, a package of saltine crackers, 3 oranges, red Twizzlers, and a jar of peanut butter, all of which he stuffed into his backpack. In his room, Zach changed into jeans, switched out his sweater for a zip-up sweatshirt, and packed a few other random things he thought he might need. $23, 20 of which had come from his aunt in a card for his birthday, a book identifying poisonous plants, in case they needed to live in the wild and eat berries, which admittedly seemed like a remote possibility, and a sleeping bag that was a little too small for him, but worked okay as a blanket when completely unzipped. In the hall closet, he found a flashlight, and he picked up a garden spade from beside the back door. Before he left, he wrote out the note and propped it up on his bed. It read, "Got up early, gone to play basketball. Might not be back for dinner." Might not be back forever, he thought, but didn't write. As he left the house, closing the door quietly behind him, he wondered, for a moment again, if this was a trick, a lie, Poppy's attempt at one last game. But the ashes had seemed real, he reminded himself. In the end, he wasn't sure if he went because he half believed in the ghost already, or because he was used to following Poppy's lead in a story, or simply because leaving allowed him to run away and still believe he could come back, if he wanted. And if you want to find out what happens next, check out Doll Bones by Holly Black. We have it here at our library. Have a great weekend, and see you next time. Bye!